Okay, so let's talk about scarcity because that's really what a lot of this is about. If there was plenty of stuff to go around, then we'd all have stuff that we could use. If there was plenty of money to go around, plenty of food to go around, then we wouldn't have a lot of these sort of poverty questions. The whole bit is that there is scarcity. So let's start with a pizza. That is my pizza right there. So let's say that I have this pizza. What are we talking about? We talk about scarcity. There are three types of scarcity we're going to talk about today. So here I've got the scarcity. Now let's imagine that I have this pizza, not this scarcity. I have this pizza, and let's imagine that. I know this is going to be a little gross. Just work with me on this. Let's imagine that let's say there's 8 of us. Okay, 8 of us, and we're going to share this pizza. And let's imagine that somebody sneezes on this half. Somehow magically we know this half gets sneezed on. This half is totally fine. So we take this half of the pizza and we throw it away because it's all super gross. And now we still have 8 people, and we're going to split the half a pizza between 8 people. We call this supply-induced scarcity, where for some reason the pizza shrinks. Okay, so that's scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, let me get my pizza back again. That's a smaller pizza. Don't worry about it. It's still the same pizza as that. Okay, so in this particular version of scarcity, these are different kinds of scarcity. Let's say that 8 more people showed up. So now there's 16 of us who want to have pizza. So now, instead of having essentially this, we all get equal pieces there. We now have to divide the pizza up like this. So now we're all getting equal slices of pizza. We're just getting less than we would have before. We call that demand-induced scarcity. Smaller pizza slices. And then the final one, again, same pizza again. So let's imagine there's 8 of us. And let's imagine 5 of us are girls, 3 are guys. And let's imagine that we then have a vote. How should we divide up the pizza? And we have a vote. And one of the proposals on the table is girls should get bigger slices than guys. So we're going to take a quarter of the pizza, and that's going to be for the guys. And the girls will get 3/4 of the pizza. And we have a vote. And lo and behold, the girls win. And so the guys each get this amount. And the girls, I'm not going to be able to do this very well here. The girls get this amount, right? We call this structural scarcity, where for some structural reason there's disproportionate pizza slices. Whether that be, again, in this sense, but it could be because of law, it could be because of politics, anything like that. There are disproportionate, some sort of structural thing that if we change the structure, like instead of having a democracy, let's have a dictatorship where a guy is in charge, you might not end up with that scenario. You might end up with a very different scenario. All right, so let's talk about policy responses first, because we have talked about this a little bit so far. So if you remember economic nationalism, what is an economic nationalist response to scarcity? And again, we'll just think in terms of pizza. So let's imagine that again. Let me have my pizza here. Let's imagine we have 8 slices. Okay, here's my pizza right here. The U.S. pizza. It's economic nationalism, my slice. Let's imagine that there's a belief that one of these 3 types of scarcity could show up. What then does economic nationalism say the United States should do? It should defend and enlarge my slice. In other words, I should make sure I don't get any less. If scarcity happens, it should happen in your area, not in my area. And if possible, I should increase the amount of pizza I get. Okay, that's economic nationalism. Not that big of a surprise. This is how capitalism essentially works. Neoliberal economics, sort of the economic liberalism we talked about, what would they say about this? So their solution would be this. I know a lot of pizzas on here. Their solution is, rather than everybody out for themselves, everybody should work together to increase the size of the pizza. So now I'm getting this much more. We all get this together. We have to find ways to enlarge the pizza or go out and find new pizzas. And a big way of this is going to be things like technology, trade, etc. And then a third policy response, Marxism. How would Marxists say about this? Marxists would say, redistribute the pizza slices. Like, they would point to structural, there is this, but this is really the thing going on. Yes, there's pollution, yes, there's population growth, but really the reason why there is so much scarcity is because the rich take all the stuff and they leave very small bit for the poor to distribute amongst themselves. Not cool. Redistribute the pizza slices. Not cool. All right, enough about pizza. Let's talk about these types of scarcity. So the first kind is supply-induced scarcity. The key factors that we're going to find here, number one is going to be overuse. So it's the inability of the resource to replenish. So let's just use water, since we've just been talking about water. We're gonna use water as an example going through this thing. The more water that we use, like we know that it rains all the time and the water gets replenished every season, but if I'm using more water this season than is being replenished, then essentially we're going to start running out of water. So overuse is one key factor, and that shrinks the pizza by essentially, shrinking the pizza. Another way you can shrink the pizza is degrade the resource in some way, like pollution. So for example, if our water gets polluted, we can't use it anymore, and so you might as well not even count it anymore. So all these things are ways that the pizza shrinks. Less clear but crucial features. So now we have to be thinking about the broader systems of this whole thing. Technology used to extract the resource. Let me give you a quick example of this. One of the main ways this can be a thing is it can lead to overuse. So, for example, fishermen back in like the 1800s, they would have nets or they would have fishing poles. Fishermen today, what they do is they have this long net and they have it between two boats. And the net drags through the water and you can pick up way more fish in an hour than you could with those other things. So the technology itself lends itself towards overuse. So technology can be a factor in overusing a resource. Ecosystem sensitivity. We sometimes talk about these things called tipping points, where a ecosystem can do pretty well until you take just a little bit more water, not all of it, but just a little bit more, and all of a sudden that causes systemic malfunctions throughout the ecosystem. There's not enough water for this, and so this particular animal dies off, and if that animal dies off, the rest of the animals die off, and so you get this sort of catastrophic cascading effect. This is what we're talking about with this complexity idea, is it's not just a simple, well, don't use as much anymore. Unforeseen negative externalities. I'm going to let you go back to your notes and remember what an externality is, but we don't always know what sort of the overuse of this particular thing is going to lead to. And then ideas. This is a really important thing, is how we think about this stuff impacts how we use it. Now, I'll give you an example here. Let's go to, all right, let's imagine a society living sort of near a waterway, and they're in danger of possibly overusing the water. Now, let's say that they have a belief that, for example, God will provide, that, God's got the whole world in his hands, he'll take care of it. So can you guys really overuse their water supply? No, because if we overuse it, God will provide more. This is what we call a metaphysical belief, that essentially if we think that's the case, then that's going to affect the way we use the resource itself. So incentives to consume the resource. For example, here's another one about water. In the United States, for example, we believe, for whatever reason, that essentially you have to wash your hands all the time. You have to take a shower all the time. Hygiene, hygiene, hygiene. Now, could human beings survive without hygiene? Of course we could. We don't need to, coronavirus is a bad time to talk about this, but we don't need to wash our hands 24/7. We don't need to take a shower every day. And yet, we believe that we do. That if you don't take a shower, you'll be shunned in society, and so you take a shower every day. you could imagine that that affects how we use the water, what kinds of water we use, etc. So just ideas, how we think about these things matter a lot. All right. So that's one kind of a scarcity, a supply-induced scarcity. A second kind of scarcity is what we call demand-induced scarcity. And the key factors here, if you can't tell from that picture, probably the number one key factor, remember this is the one where the pizza, more people showed up, and so there's smaller pizza slices. So really one of the big things is going to be population size. As population grows in a particular area, there's going to be more of a demand on things. And that's going to, let me just talk about, well, hold on, let me see if I need to do that. Yeah, I'll talk about that later here. Another is per capita use. How much is each person demanding? So again, so this idea of how much does each person want to use of that thing, that can create scarcity as well. Some less clear factors, again, level of economic development. What we know, here's an interesting thing that we know, is that as populations get wealthier, as GDP goes up, the demand for resources goes up as well. So think about it this way. As China begins to become more wealthy and has a middle class, those people are going to want to drive cars as well. So now all of a sudden, these people who didn't need oil now need oil. So level of economic development actually drives that up. So this is, again, one of those weird things, as we've been talking about, how do we increase the economic development of these areas? Well, you're going to get a feedback effect on this, is that there's going to be more demand-induced scarcity that's going to be caused even as you're creating a better situation. We would love everyone in the world to be out of poverty, but those of us that drive cars don't want everybody to drive cars, because then oil prices are going to go way through the roof. So this is one of those tricky things about that. Here's another one that's tricky, urbanization. So again, urbanization is a lot of people sort of packing into this area. That's, by in and of itself, definitionally, is going to cause population size and demand-induced scarcity in that area. But there's more to it than that, is as you have all these people living in the city, the sources of that, let's think about water for a second. The sources of the water now are pushed further and further and further outside of the center of the city, because that's where people are living. So if I need to get water, I have to either bring it in or I have to go get it, which is further away, which then creates more scarcity as well. And then we have to throw those ideas in again, that those will impact how we think about the resources and how we think about how much we're supposed to use or think we ought to use, etc., plays a role in scarcity as well. One more thing, and here's another complexity. Demand-induced scarcity can drive supply scarcity. So as we get population growth, for example, in an area, that's more people living near this water area, which increases the risk of overuse, increases the risk of pollution, which then, while you have the demand-induced scarcity caused by, so you have essentially a pizza, and now you have more and more people wanting slices of that pizza, and because there's more people there, that's causing some of those slices to be polluted, shrinking my pizza. So you can see how that they sort of drive each other. It's not just a simple thing of stop this and you stop that. It's a sort of a cyclical thing. The third scarcity, and this is the tougher one to talk about, probably one we should spend more time on, and probably one that actually, not just the Marxists me saying this, but there is probably a very important one, and that is that structural induced scarcity. And this is that idea of there's disproportionate pizza slices because of some system that says you get this much, you get this much. The question becomes, why do some people get more than others? Probably the main factor in this is this thing that we talk about in capitalism is very important, and that is property rights. What is the property rights system you have? What's the law about that? So, for example, I have this stuff because the law says I have this stuff. I have control over this waterway because the law says I have control over this waterway. Well, what if I need it? It doesn't matter. I have control over it, right? That is sort of structural scarcity right there. Factors that determine this main factor. So what goes into this sort of property rights thing? Well, it's the society's current wealth and power concentration and distribution. Like, who's got the stuff today? They're going to use that wealth that they have to protect that stuff. That's just not a big secret. A second thing is going to be path dependence. And this is just what I mean by here is just history. In other words, whoever was wealthy last year used their wealth to protect their wealth today. So it's not a big surprise that the rich get richer, I guess is the way to say this. A good way to think about this would be to think about the civil rights in the United States. Throughout the history of the United States, there's been that racial division, and whites have had more access legally and historically and all that stuff to wealth, education, all that kind of stuff. So then along in the 1960s comes the Civil Rights Act, which says, all right, everybody's equal. Well, that's true, everybody's equal, but the systems that are already in place are protecting the wealth of those who already have wealth. And so now you have this group who are historically have been sort of left out of that legal system. You know, they're not going to be able to compete equally, even though the law says you can compete equally. Ideas are going to play a role in this as well. So, for example, if we believe capitalism is natural, then the system we have isn't unfair. It's just how the system is. Deal with it. The fact that you're getting a smaller slice is not, a disproportionate, unfair, anything like that. That's just how it should be. And so there's really nothing that we should be talking about here. Another thing is wealth should be the determining factor of access. This has been a big conversation with the coronavirus lately, is who should get access to the testing? Who should get access, if there's relatively scarce testing supplies, who should have access to it? Well, whoever can pay for it. Is that the right answer? Does that seem right? That's where it gets very complex in that whole thing. So we have scarcity. Scarcity is going to be this sort of big issue, and just in of itself, I don't want to go too much further into it right now, but just this idea of how these things play out are complex in themselves. If you want to intervene and sort of say, we need to provide more here, we need to solve this global water problem, we want to avoid a war between Egypt and Ethiopia, or a war between over water rights in the Middle East, or over oil in the Middle East. These are all very complex things that need to be sort of thought through and figured out, understanding that different things are impacting a wide variety of elements. I know that's not a very good way to say that, but that's sort of where we're starting. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make this even more complex. We're going to talk about more complex systems. Remember, this is an intro class, so we're not going to go hardcore on these things, but just what are some of the other things we should be thinking about, and then we'll go from there.